Good morning, everyone. My name is Winnie Stackelberg, and I'm the Executive Vice President of the Center for American Progress. And I am thrilled to welcome each of you here today as we discuss how immigrants continue to transform and enrich our entire national identity. At a time when too many observers falsely assume that progressives only reside in large urban areas, today's conversation will center around a new CAP report that focuses on two towns located on the plains of Nebraska. Lexington, which is found in the state's southern region, and Madison, which is found in its northeast corner. Back in 1990, there was only a combined total of 124 adult immigrants living in both of these places. But today, nearly half of the roughly 7,000 adults in Lexington were born in a different country, while 1/3 of the 1,900 adults living in Madison are also immigrants. Over the past 3 decades, folks in both towns have learned to embrace the many contributions of their neighbors that their neighbors have made to their communities. While there were certainly some challenges along the way, and you may hear about some of them today, it was the values of patience and tolerance that prevailed in the end. In conducting research for CAP's new report, author Sara McElmurry interviewed more than 70 residents and civic leaders in Lexington and Madison who discussed their collective efforts to make immigrants feel welcomed and how these efforts have made their communities stronger for the long term. Her report is a part of ongoing initiative here at CAP that seeks to detail the demographic changes taking place in rural communities all across the United States, and to discover how different communities are adapting to the growth of their immigrant populations. In fact, earlier this year, we published groundbreaking work on the important role that immigrants are now playing to offset population decline and stagnation in many rural areas. We hope that the examples of Lexington and Madison can help provide a roadmap for rural communities throughout the country, and I encourage everyone to download a copy of our report by visiting CAP's website. We believe the experience of these two communities are especially important in our current climate, when too many politicians are trying to pit different segments of America against one another and spew hateful rhetoric around and about immigrants and refugees. I'm glad to say that last week, people across the nation chose the ideals, by and large, of acceptance and hope over the politics of fear and division. Initial polls have found a groundswell in turnout among young and Hispanic voters, and the American public elected a wave of leaders with congressional members in mind, with compassion and progressive views on immigration, not just along the coasts, but in Midwestern states such as Kansas and Southwestern communities such as New Mexico and Arizona. And today, CAP is proud to welcome a lineup of inspiring panelists who are working to advance progressive values in Nebraska and throughout the United States. Now, I have the pleasure of turning the program over to Nicole Svitlenka, a policy analyst here at CAP, who will moderate our discussion. Thank you, everyone, and please enjoy our event. Nicole.
Thanks for that introduction, Winnie, and thank you all for coming today. My name is Nicole Svitlenka, and I'm a senior policy analyst with the immigration team here at the Center for American Progress. We've got a great panel here today to discuss the successes and challenges of demographic shifts that have happened in Lexington and Madison, Nebraska, as well as throughout the country. I'm especially excited that today we have two Lexington residents on the panel with us to share their experiences. So without any further ado, let me introduce our panelist. To my far right, we have Sara McElmurry, our report author. Sara is a communications strategist and non-resident fellow with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Next to Sara is Ali Noorani, executive director of the National Immigration Forum here in Washington, D.C. To Ali's left is Dora Vivas. Dora is a member of Lexington City Council. And to my immediate right is Kyle Hayner, principal of Lexington High School. Sara, I'd like to start with you. This paper is so rich and it gives us so many details of what's happened in the last several decades in Lexington and Madison. You're from Chicago and you're based there now, so far from rural. Can you tell us what it was like to visit these places and what perhaps you found most surprising in your research?
Sure, and thank you so much for the invitation to join you this morning. Want to start off just with acknowledging that change is hard, especially managing demographic change, and that was really the premise of this project. We've heard so much over the past 2 years about how managing demographic change has divided communities across our country, especially small towns and rural places. But instead of kind of adding to that rhetoric and divisiveness, the CAP team in formulating this really set out to add to the conversation about what's working, kind of unpacking solutions. So Lexington and Madison weren't on our radars initially. I had only ever been to Omaha, to be honest, to be in Nebraska. The team sliced and diced census data to sort of discover communities that had experienced rapid demographic change in recent decades. And then we added a filter of rurality to be able to identify small towns and rural communities. And Madison and Lexington floated to the top of the list. Now, these towns are small by Chicago standards. They're small by DC standards. They're probably small by Nebraska standards as well. As Winnie shared, Madison has just 2,600 residents. Lexington has just over 10,000 now, as I was learning. And for years, they looked like what we would expect rural Nebraska to look like. They were very homogeneous, largely white places. As you heard, the two towns combined had just 124 foreign-born residents in 1990. But then meatpacking plants arrived in the late 80s and early 90s, and foreign-born workers and their families followed, and that's when the changes began. So today, half of Lexington's adult population is foreign-born, 1/3 of Madison's, and the schools are even more diverse. As you'll hear from Kyle, 80+% of the students come from Latino backgrounds, and there's additional diversity as well. The towns themselves are largely Latino, largely Mexican, with Central American and Cuban populations as well. And in recent years, they've received a new wave of newcomers. In Madison, refugees, the Karen people coming from Myanmar or Burma, and in Lexington, Somali refugees. Their downtowns now reflect their multicultural makeups. There's Mexican taquerias, there's Salvadoran pupuserias, there are Spanish language services at churches, there's mosques, there's African grocery stores, there are bilingual programs in the schools. And despite all of these changes, the town still felt very Nebraskan to me when I visited them. I was there at the end of August. Schools and communities were preparing for homecoming, football games, sort of decades-old traditions that will continue to guide these communities forward. Small town life, very similar to the small town I grew up in, still revolves around hard work, family values, and strong faith, even if people's religions may be different. So again, I traveled to Lexington and Madison in August. I spoke to dozens of people, civic leaders, elected officials, school administrators, nonprofit leaders, refugees, immigrants, and lifelong residents alike. And they all came from very different backgrounds. They all had very different perspectives, but they agreed on one thing. The last 30 years have been bumpy. The work is still, what they would agree, largely in progress, but it's all been worth it. The effort was worth it. And that's really different from the headlines and the rhetoric that we hear on this issue. So today, these tiny communities are arguably just as diverse as my neighborhood back home in Chicago, very multicultural, Rogers Park. But they're united by some common core values that I don't necessarily see in city living. There's an affinity for small town living that has helped people find common ground. And this leads me to challenge the stereotype that small towns or rural communities are somehow intrinsically insular or intolerant places. And I think we all have a lot to learn from how these two communities and their residents have rolled up their sleeves, managed change, and come out stronger because of it. And I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation.
Thanks, Sarah. Next, I want to turn to Dora. Dora, you arrived in Lexington in 1991, and in 2012, you became the first Latina elected to the city council. Can you describe for us what Lexington was like when you first got there, and if there was perhaps a breakthrough moment that brought long-term residents and newcomers together?
Can you hear me? Really? No? Okay. Thank you for inviting me here. And yes, I arrived from Mexico in 1991 to Lexington from Mexico. I was in Mexico trying to continue my education down there, but I wanted to experience how it was to be visiting the United States. So I arrived to Lexington in 1990, and I stayed there for until this time. When I arrived to Lexington, the town was like 90% Anglo people and like 10% Hispanics. They were there for a long time. It was not many bilingual people at that time, so it was for someone that came from another country, not knowing the language like myself, it was really hard. I faced many challenges. The first challenge was the language barrier. It was really hard to do almost anything. Lexington was not ready for all these immigrants that IBP was bringing to Lexington because it was no places to rent. It was not, they didn't want to rent to Hispanics because it was houses, but they just did not want to rent it. I find out that later. And I can understand that because it was even hard to talk to the landlord to ask him for a rent. So the nice thing about Lexington, they have this place to live they call Heaven House. And they help the immigrants to get started and to live there for free until they find a place to live. I lived at that house until I found a place to go. Later on, there was some mobile homes available to rent. And most of the Hispanics people were living at that mobile home, and people in town, they used to call Little Mexico with another negative comments about it because we all were like congregated there living. The other challenge was to find your products that you use to cook. It was at the stores, it was not many Hispanic products, and it was really hard to find things that you were used to cook, so we had to get to the new culture or get adjusted. And it was just, whenever you go to any places to do the basic things like turn on the electricity, the gas, connect the phone call, you always have to find the place, someone to help you translate. And I was told once, like, go back home. So back in my mind is like, no, I'm gonna stay here. And a lot of times people used to make the comments like, you should speak English. And now back in my mind is like, I will someday. And it was just like the town was not ready for. But once in 1996 approximately, people start buying their houses. That's when it turns the economy in Lexington, and that's when the business were getting prospected by those people that were buying the houses. Like the realtors start liking the Hispanics buying houses. The banks start liking the car dealers. They start making business, and they start hiring bilingual people. By that time, some of the people that was there, they were ready. They were ready to start working besides outside the plan. I work at IBP, MAPAC, for 6 years, and then I had the opportunity to start working at the insurance office, just filing documents. For me, coming from Mexico with administration diploma degree, it was simple to do filing. It was like nothing. So I started working as a filing documents, and then later on, I learned how to do the insurance, and I became an insurance agent. And places were start hiring bilinguals. So I always said that I was lucky to be on that town when there was no bilingual, because that forced myself to learn the language. When people were telling me, you need to speak the language, I was just like, yes, I will. And I'm still learning. I'm getting there, but I'm able to communicate now. When I see immigrants coming to the town, I always reach out to them to help them. I became a notary because I want to help them. I saw the struggle to finding notaries to help you with the documents. I was doing all the things that I could do. I'm still doing it to help the community to get by and not get so struggle. Now it's simple to be there, and people doesn't even try, because the first thing you do when you go places, you ask, does someone speak Spanish? It's just it's easier, but on the other end, it's not gonna make them progress or make the change to learn the language. Let's see. After all those years now, the community was adjusted for the Hispanic people, and now the new challenges that we have, the new income, the new people that came from Somali. So Somali is a new, different thing, and now we're going to redo the wheel again, because we thought it was done, and we get used to the Mexican food, Mexican restaurants. The stores were reaching out to the community to ask them, what can we do for you? What products do you guys need? And they got it, they did it. Walmart has a big aisle of Mexican products, and they do have a lot of business now. So now the community is used to multicultural, and now we're trying to get used to get to know the new Somali community that came to town.
Thanks, Dora. So Kyle, turning to you, as the principal in Lexington, you see how this work to integrate communities is ongoing. Can you tell us about your perspective as an educator and an administrator, especially what it's like to work in such a diverse context within the region?
I've actually had the opportunity to, for 26 years, I was an English journalism teacher at a school 38 miles away, which is very typical of Nebraska demographically. It was about 95% white, very affluent, middle class, upper middle class, and my perception of Lexington at that time, which was down the road, was completely different than it is now. Obviously, that was 12 years ago, and when coming to Lexington, it is right now our high school is 80% poverty. We're about 85 to 90% minority, 25% English language learner population, and between 25 and 30% of our students are first-generation immigrants, refugees. So a far cry, just 38 miles down the road, but a far cry from not just that school, but basically Nebraska. And I think Sara talked about the stereotypes. I had those stereotypes. It's ignorance at that time. Lexington used to be kind of like the Kearney 30 years ago, okay? And smaller Kearney, which is where I was teaching, and had a very abrupt change. It used to be a landing place, a destination point for teachers, as is Kearney. It passed right over the stepping stone status to don't ever go there status. That was kind of the perception, I think. I had that perception. Got to a point where I wanted a challenge, and I wanted to do something different, something that would blow my hair back, and it has. It's turned it gray, but it's been wonderful, and the challenges are there. They're just different than what I anticipated because my lens was so different than what it actually is now. Sara talked about stereotyping. The stereotypical perception of Latino students, poverty students, ELL population is they don't go to school and they don't graduate. Well, we have a 96% daily attendance rate, and our graduation rate is 3 points higher than the state average, which is number 2 in the nation. So it's speaking well, we're about 92% over the last 5 years due to a lot of people like Dora, the community, and just a lot of great things happening. In fact, I have many mantras, sayings. One of them is we love to do those things that others say is impossible. And they say it's impossible to get minority students to school, to graduate, and we're kind of bent on doing what others perceive to be impossible and then moving on to the next impossible. So it's a great place to be.
Okay, thank you. So Ali, at the National Immigration Forum, you lead an initiative that engages faith leaders, law enforcement officials, and business leaders around sensible policies on immigration. You also recently wrote a book that has many similar themes to Sara's report on why the entirety of a community stands to benefit from welcoming its newest neighbors. Does what you've heard so far about Lexington resonate with what you've seen in other parts of the country?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, I really want to thank CAP for pulling together the panel, but also making sure that the report is and the information that Sara gathered is not just seeing the light of the day, but really helping advance an agenda for the organization and for the progressive community overall. I mean, what we've talked about so far in terms of where Madison and Lexington have come from and where they're going is, frankly, what we see across the country. A place that, we often talk about as Storm Lake, Iowa. It's about 13,000 people. It's changed dramatically in the last 30 years. They're represented in Congress by Steve King. But the civic leadership, the city council, the mayor, school superintendent, school leadership, the police chief, business leadership, when they saw these changes happening in their small town, they said, you know what, we're going to make sure that we as a community, we as a region are welcoming immigrants and that, frankly, we are going to thrive as a town because of immigration. Now, Storm Lake and the county is one of the few towns and counties in the entire state that's growing. And when I was there over the summer, the mayor of Storm Lake, Mike Porsche, told me that they would have more businesses coming to Storm Lake if they could grow fast enough. So, Mark Prosser is the police chief. He tells me, we're managing the problems that small town leadership would love to manage, and those problems are growth. Most small towns are managing and trying to figure out the crisis of contraction and shrinkage. So I just think that when you travel the country and you talk to leadership in the small towns and cities that are thriving, really quickly you see that it's the small towns and cities that are welcoming immigrants, that are doing the hard work necessary to help folks who've been there for generations understand these changes. And it's not easy, right? There are bumps in the road, right? But if the leadership is willing to make the case and do the work, then in the long run, actually in the short run, these towns prosper.
Thanks. So one of the goals of the research and the work that we're doing is to try and come up with a roadmap for inclusion so that rural places that are beginning to experience the demographic changes that, say, Lexington or Madison or Storm Lake have experienced, know how to approach that and perhaps anticipate some of those road bumps. So I'll pose this question to the group, but what are some of the lessons, either from your research, your experience, your work, that you could share for these communities?
Well, there's 9 in the report, so I will, I'll give you 3, and hopefully it piques your interest so everyone will read the report and get the whole list of 9.
You're not going to make us guess the rest?
Yeah. So again, there were so many great examples and lessons learned from my time in these 2 communities, and I'm sure others on stage will add to this list. But I would point to 3. So again, leadership coming out of City Hall, is critical, and both towns enjoyed very supportive mayors, very supportive city council members on this issue. But the idea of governing consistently. So I think leadership in both places were really invested in making these communities places where all members felt that they were welcomed and could live and thrive. So not making policies specific to newcomers, not making policies specific to long-term residents, really finding that place where all folks felt welcomed. And there's some really illuminating examples I can share later in the conversation. City Hall in both of those places was small. Resources are tight. These are small towns. I mean, coming from Chicago, I come from a government with a 37-point plan around welcoming new Americans and newcomers in Chicago. That's certainly not the case in Lexington or Madison. So where those resources left off, partnerships really picked up and helped move this work forward. And there's two key institutions in both towns that I think were sort of de facto anchors for this work. And they were the schools, as Kyle will talk about, and the meatpacking plants, which are now Tyson. And both of these places, if you think about them, are places where large majorities of the population, youth, students, and working adults are spending 8+ hours together in very intense learning environments or very intense working environments. They are shoulder to shoulder working on the line, developing sort of mutual trust and respect. And in schools, they're learning together, they're going through extracurriculars, they're participating in sports, and their parents, in turn, are finding these hubs in commonality. So a lot of the integration that's happening in these two communities is happening in these two places and then sort of trickling out into the rest of the community. And then the third magic bullet I would offer is time, and it's really about being patient. I think we're seeing Lexington and Madison 30 years into a really, really challenging demographic experiment that's still happening. But that's really been the case throughout the course of our country. You have the new guy comes in, he learns the ropes, he learns the language, sort of the linguistic and cultural differences sort of mitigate. The new culture adds to the existing culture benefits from the new culture, and we all move on. And that's really been the course of our country. I think where we can move forward is beginning to reflect on lessons from these past cycles and past generations and hope to engage them moving forward.
To unpack a little bit more on some of those themes, Kyle, can you tell us more about the school serving as an anchor institution, some of the programming that may have changed to reflect the changes in the community?
We had about a $3 million addition to our school, and when we did that a couple of years ago, we really wanted to give a clearer picture of what we're trying to do. And so in a community that has a proud tradition of high academic standing, 31 state championships in various things, athletic contests, a lot of those people still live in Lexington. There was a grand exodus, a lot left, shame on them. Those that stayed are all in. And so what we did is we have it's a trophy case of 31 state championships, a lot of the academic successes we've had on another wall. Right above us are the 41 flags of the nations that our kids represent, and over 30 languages. So we want to honor the past, respect that, and one of the coolest things that I saw, and I didn't get a picture, was we had a pro football player, Mick Tinglehoff, who was an all-pro, came back to visit on the 50th anniversary, and there were 8 Hispanic kids standing around him, and he's this big lineman, this great big white guy, and here are Hispanic kids, and nobody set it up. They were just talking to each other and finding out. And so those are the kind of things that happen. But at the school, I think it's really important to build a sense of community before reaching out to the community. With the national landscape, a lot of the things that we're all facing, there's a lack of trust. And so how do you build that trust? Through very important, strong, genuine, sustainable relationships, not contrived, can't be. And so we really are intentional about daily in our advisory programs, a lot of the things we do, making sure that our kids have adult advocates, We teach them to advocate for themselves. One of the things that we build on that you'll see on our building wall is teachers will never give up on students. Students will never give up on themselves, and they will never give up on each other. And that sounds like a corny, yeah, whatever, but we remind people daily about that. And so you're all in. The one thing about being in our school is you go home, but you never leave what's going on. We go home tired every night, but we usually have a smile on our face because a lot of great things have happened. And so I think that it really, everything we do, and there are a lot of programmatic changes that have gone on in the 12 years that I've been there that we've put in place. Some have been stinkers, and so we go the other direction, but those that have been valuable all revolve around those relational leadership, servant leadership, and working together. I want to say one thing. I have a tendency to talk too much, so you just have to stop me. You won't. But I always use the line. I think I was speaking at the Department of Education here in Washington a couple of years ago and said, "We don't see color," and of course everybody rolled their eyes, And my intent was that we don't put any emphasis on high or low. It's just we just are who we are, and that's cool. And a little guy, Edwin Ortiz, who was our little Guatemalan king this year for homecoming. Said, "Mr. Hayner, I get what you mean, and that's all cool and everything, but I wish you'd say we're like a box of crayons, because we are different colors, but we're all unique and important and equally important as you're trying to say." And so I was taught a lesson on that, and so I'm going to share that. It'll be a part of my book, and I will not give him credit probably, but no, it's just there's a lot of learning. And the thing that and this will probably come as a shock, is to just shut up and listen. Listen to other people, listen to other cultures, honor what they have to say. Quit trying to adapt them to what you think they need. Those assumptions kill us. But just to be open-minded. Our Somali kids leave for prayer every day. We have a very high Catholic population in our Hispanic community. But again, with 41 countries and 30 languages, we just have a lot going on, and we just try to honor everyone. So anyway, that's part of it.
And Sara, you talked about governing consistently and leadership in City Hall, and so that makes me want to turn to Dora as a member of the City Council. What kind of efforts has the council undertaken? Have they been successful? Do you get good traction in your efforts?
Yeah, what we've been trying to do is reach out to people, get to know the community before we judge them, and learn from the community or the cultures. So what we've been trying to do is hire bilingual police officers, hire bilingual staff, send information, and the website for the city is English and Spanish, and it helps a lot because the new generations are able to communicate, are able to read, but we cannot forget the first generation. They arrived to Lexington. For some reason, they were not fortunate to learn the language. So we need to think about them because they are the pillars from the houses. So if the household doesn't know what's going on, the kids are not going to have a good feeling of what to do. So the city has been trying to get to know the community. It was a need of a indoor facility because soccer is a big thing in Lexington. And the rest of the community were like, no, we want football. Well, for Mexican or Hispanics, football is soccer. And with the indoor building, and Kyle can echo on that, it was a great thing to bring those cultures. And now it's not only Hispanics that play soccer, it's like anybody else. And high school has an excellent team on that. So just working, the thing that did not work is we sent a survey to the community to find out what they want. That did not work because, first of all, not many people has access to the computer, or they just don't like, but the one-on-one, it works better.
So obviously these types of changes, this population change can bring some bumps along the road, and I don't want to sugarcoat the fact that we're hearing from somewhere that's done a really great job. What were some of the more unexpected challenges specific to a rural community for anyone?
Well, yeah, Dora talked about our soccer team. We didn't used to be very good, but we've gotten better. Our Hispanic population, obviously, that is what they grow up playing. And I was actually the boys basketball coach at that school down the road, which is one of the largest schools in the state, and we used to play Lexington. And our student section was terrible. Some of the things they did, 20, 25 years ago, and it was disgusting. And we didn't support that, but it was just kind of that perception. And so when I came to Lexington, they were getting beat again. Again, this isn't the end-all or the answer for everything, but we got better in soccer. And what we tried to tell our kids is we'll do our talking on the field. You didn't say that when we were bad. We say it when we're good. And so we go out and we have one of the best soccer teams in the state. And so we shake hands and we smile, and inside we're going, yeah, just keep talking, because we do hear a lot of name calling and things that are just, I think it's ignorance, but being able to separate between that ignorance and just meanness, knowing better and still doing it, I don't know what that is, but our kids have learned. Last year, we had some tough experiences, even last year, in the athletic arena, where other towns were calling our kids names. Volleyball game inside the border, outside the border, as the ball would go out, and our kids didn't respond. I was so proud of them. They didn't. But then there's a line where you kind of want them to, but we want to do it in a way that is above and beyond what they're going to do. We're not going to sully ourselves in the mud like they are. So we went to the state of Nebraska and just said, listen, this stuff needs to stop. And the director was all in. He happened to be a friend, and sent out a memorandum that this needed to end, and actually called out certain schools that were for their behavior. And really, it's kind of like, even what we hear in the national landscape, we talk about a percentage of people within a certain culture that aren't doing things the right way or doing things outside, and then we say this is everybody. Okay, well, all these schools, they weren't all bad either. There was a few kids making bad decisions, and it's cleaned up just in that matter of time. But those are things that are hard to deal with and share with your kids. Okay, how do we respond to this? And being able to do that, I think, is really difficult. But we've probably made some bad decisions along the way in that capacity too. But I think we're in a better place now because of those challenges.
I wanted to underscore something that Dora mentioned in terms of law enforcement. And over the last couple of years, we've built a task force, a law enforcement immigration task force, and it's about 120 police chiefs and sheriffs from across the country. And what we found is that the police chiefs and the sheriffs from the rural counties and the small towns, they really understand the importance of having bilingual officers. And it comes up in interesting places. So there's a Palestine, Texas, as far, I think it's East Texas. Chief Harvey recently got to Palestine. He was, I want to say, in San Antonio before, kind of obviously a much larger city. And he landed, and he immediately, looked at the diversity of his force, how his force was engaging with a fast, diversifying community. But at the end of the day, Palestine, Texas is a very conservative town, very conservative. So he found himself in this place where he wanted to make sure that he and his officers could fulfill their oath to serve and protect the entirety of Palestine. And the only way to do that was to make sure that they were seen as something completely different from immigration enforcement, not taking on immigration enforcement responsibilities, but ultimately, at the end of the day, their job was public safety. And it's an ongoing process, and he's always, redoubling his efforts to communicate with the immigrant community, with the non-immigrant community, and again, really trying to make sure that his officers are representative of the community. And that doesn't happen overnight, but it's those kinds of policy changes that local government and local leadership puts into place that the impact is exponential for both the immigrant community and folks who've been there for generations.
I wanted to build on Kyle's remarks and sort of echo Ali on just the sense of community and culture that gets built. And not being from Nebraska, I sort of visited this state with an appreciation for how important football was to sort of the core culture. You hear about Friday Night Lights. I think I saw a New York Times study about Nebraska being the state that puts football at the second most important, right after Texas or something like this. So in Madison, the other community I visited, football is equally important. And I think the community, in seeing the school shift to a majority Latino school where students were physically smaller in stature and hadn't grown up playing American football, they grew up playing football, to Dora's point, the team suffered. The team suffered devastating losses. There was morale problems. They forfeited games, and the community really felt this. I think in a small town, you go to a football game on Friday night. That's what you do, right? So there was this idea of these newcomers have come. They're changing our culture. Our football team isn't good anymore. We don't even have football. So the school district worked on this. They wanted to boost the students' morale. They wanted to boost the team's morale, and the town's morale. And this is where I'm going to get technical, and the two Nebraskans will help me. The school shifted from 11-man football to 8-man football. Yes? In Madison. This past year. An 8-man football requires more dexterity. Bulk isn't as big of a deal. You need speed. You don't need heft. And the school won its first game this fall. The entire town came out to support them. 500 people in this town of 2,600 spilling out of the bleachers, lined up along the field, cheering these guys on. And I think that's an important example of how culture can continue. This small town tradition can definitely continue with little tiny tweaks that are so insignificant. And I think this idea of fear and culture shift that gets so often linked to a security argument or a demographic argument is really about these very superficial things that can be fixed if we're just willing to make these small tweaks and meet each other in the middle. So football was something I heard consistently in both towns that was tied so importantly to culture, and I think that's also a rallying point for this new multicultural community moving forward.
So a lot of smaller towns that have had immigrants move to them over the past 20 or so years are now facing another wave of immigration. More people are coming, there are jobs to be filled, and in the case of Lexington, we're looking at refugees from Somalia. And so we had a white and a Latino town. There was well established, a lot of time had elapsed, people had gotten used to one another, and there's a whole new wave of immigration coming that looks different yet again. What kinds of things are happening on the ground, and what's happening in communities where another new set of neighbors are coming?
Big surprise. The Somali community is just so different, their religion and the traditional dress. So it is for many of us, they don't have the knowledge, and we were not educated at school about the culture. It's just so different. But one of the things in Lexington is the town was built with immigrants, and it was not the welcoming of these new immigrants from Somalia. It was hard. It wasn't easier, but it wasn't as hard as when you walk in an Anglo town, because now we don't feel like this is our town. We feel like we came also, and we make our way to be welcome. So we need to welcome them, and we need to understand them. But it's not easy. They have their culture is so different. Women's traditional custom is you just see their arms. You cannot shake hands. Mexican people is so used to shake hands, and Anglo people is just say bye, hi. So it's so different. And the guys, they're not allowed the women to talk to others. So I struggled in the beginning until I get to know them. Once you get to know them, they're humans. They're really nice people. Their food is delicious. They have so many things that they struggle, and they are here to looking for a different life. So my takeaway from that is just treat them be a human, treat them, help them. I had the opportunity to, I own some property, and I rent them they struggle the same as the Hispanics. They will not find a place to live because no one wants to rent it to them because of what people was talking about them. So I start getting to know them by being the landlord. I put my landlord hat, and I start going to their houses and teach them how to clean the house, what products to use. And people were saying, no, we don't want to rent them because they're not clean. It wasn't that they're not clean. They just did not know how to do it, what to use. So I used to bring my Clorox, my extra cleaning products, and I show it to them. The next time they will buy it themselves, they will use it. And I always like to tell this story. I checked the house one time, and the bathroom was not clean. So I went out, put my gloves, and blended Clorox, and I told the lady, come here, Firi. Firi means see. I'm working on my Somali language, so I'm going to 30 words now. So I just told them, Firi, Firi, which is come and see. So I show her, and she's like, no, Dora, you don't clean. I said, why not? No, you don't clean you don't clean the bathrooms. I said, yes, we need to do that. And they said, well, we didn't have any toilets down there. That's why we didn't think that we need to clean it. So, it's just get to know people before you judge them. And at the end, you learn so much now. I'm learning Somali, and I like their Somali food.
We've more than doubled our African population, student demographics, I think in the last probably 5 or 6 years. We're about 10%, I think, African. I think years ago there was a Sudanese population that came to Lexington, moved on down to Grand Island, Lincoln, Omaha, and now we're Somali, Ethiopia, Kenya, a number of different countries, but it is different. And the eye opener for me was I just traveled to the Dominican Republic, not the beach, up in Constanza. We built an elementary school, and they do things differently with their bathrooms than we do back here too. So it was an eye opener because it's just simply not knowing. We take care of some Sudanese kids, and we showed up one day and the oven was on fire. They had put the pizza, we'd explained how you can reheat pizza, and they'd put it in with the box, and just things like that we take for granted. But it has been a wonderful thing because, again, it's something that we didn't know about. And again, shut up and listen, learn. And, we had a state senator in our school the other day, and at our table it's supposed to be 8 people, but we have a lot of small people. So there are like 12 people at the table, and 9 countries were represented, and you wouldn't know the difference. So there's a lot of that sharing that goes on. Our kids learn a lot in the classroom, but they also learn a lot on field trips or sporting events, things like that, where the language actually increases exponentially. So hopefully good language, appropriate language. But anyway, so it's just that just crossing over and welcoming and being understanding and open.
I guess one thing I would add here is the cultural touch point of rural America in many cases is religion. And when I was doing some research, I remember going to Spartanburg, South Carolina, which has changed pretty dramatic. The state of South Carolina has changed dramatically, and this particular community has had an influx of both Latinos as well as refugees from around the world. And I remember talking to the leadership of First Baptist Church in Spartanburg, one of the largest Southern Baptist churches in the state, and they were so thrilled about the idea of helping refugees from around the world settle in Spartanburg, and they saw it as their role from a faith perspective to help this process, regardless of a person's religion. And now, as a result, whether it's Spartanburg or other parts of the country, we're finding that it's often the idea of religious liberty and the freedom to practice your religion, regardless of where you came from. That can be a very interesting kind of a binding moment for a community. And as progressives, we're not terribly good about talking about religion. We have a tendency to kind of flinch up a little bit, and we have a different perception of what religious liberty may or may not be. But for people of faith in rural communities and conservative communities, it is really important. And when the Catholic, the evangelical community leadership, and is able to sit across a table from a Muslim community and say, you know what, we just want to practice our religion, it moves the conversation in a different place.
Absolutely. I think that's that shared faith, not necessarily shared religion, but a shared faith is absolutely a place where common ground is being built. I recall being in Lexington, sort of main business district, Main Street, being at a shop owned by a woman from Mexico who had taken in a young woman from Central America, an unaccompanied minor, a teenager who was sort of had come home from school and was helping her in the shop, and telling me this really horrific story about what the young lady had gone through, and expressing a faith in God, sort of moving them forward and would protect them in the future. I crossed the street and went into a Somali-owned restaurant and had almost an identical conversation with the Muslim owners about their own journey from a refugee camp, being resettled in Minneapolis, and then ending up in Lexington, and trusting again that a higher power was backing them and would move them forward. And it struck me, these two communities have very much a shared lived reality and a very strong faith that's guiding them forward. Many of the town's residents, long-term white residents that I met in both places, expressed a religious conviction to welcome the newcomers as part of their faith. There's a very strong Christian tradition there as well. So I think absolutely this shared sense of faith will be a rallying point in these smaller towns that necessarily folks in urban areas don't find it as a common ground.
I'd like to open up the discussion to questions from the audience. We'll have Diane come through with a microphone. So if you have a question, please wait for her and then share your name and your organization.
Hi, my name is Jim Webster. I've been an agricultural reporter in Washington for the last 30 or 40 years, but I'm a Nebraska native. And this has been a lot of old home week for me because I was born 80 years ago in Grand Island, lived in Alliance, North Bend, and St. Paul. I had a cousin, Dick O'Neill, who taught or coached football in Kearney, Stapleton, Pleasanton. Yeah. I knew KRVN when I was working for United Press in Omaha in the 1950s. Here was this farm station in Lexington, Nebraska, that was at 50,000 watts, well known all over the country. We provided them some news. Came to Washington, went to work on the Senate staff and got to know Hubert Humphrey. Found out that after Humphrey died, his wife, Muriel, married Max Brown, the founder of KRVN in Lexington. So that sort of brings, that's the commentary that will precede the question. In the acclamation of first the Latinos and maybe a little later the Somalis and others, how did KRVN and the other media in those areas deal with it? Were they obstacles? Were they neutral? Were they helpful? And the same question would apply to the churches, Catholic, Protestant. That's about all there would have been initially in those towns. How did they facilitate or oppose the integration that you've achieved?
In the medium KRVN, to me, I think they still need to do a little bit more work to reach out to the community. They're just trying to make their business work, and they haven't get to the magic point where they need to get to know the community. The paper does. They hire bilingual people, and like I said, it's so important to have bilingual people because you understand the cultures of the others. And the church, they did get it. They bring a bilingual preachers because they knew how important was the faith for the Hispanics, and only a Hispanic will understand how important is the celebration on December 12, which is the Virgin Mary. That helps to build the connections. When it's not bilingual preach at the church, you don't feel that. You had the faith, but you don't feel the closest to go to the church, and that helps the church to grow if they have someone that you can relate it to.
I spoke to newspaper editors in both communities, and newspaper editors obviously have really, their business is following the news, sort of following the pulse of these communities. And I was really impressed with the Lexington paper, the Clipper Herald, in a community of that size, in a time when newspapers are shutting down and shuttering and sort of scaling back operations. They produce a monthly Spanish language paper called Que Pasa. that has been, from what I understand, a real lifeline to get information out to the Latino community. The editor did share with me struggles of trying to find bilingual staff, representative staff, which is, I think, a phenomenon that isn't unique to Lexington. It's a phenomenon that's shared with newspaper editors across the country, but I was very impressed by that publication. The community of Madison is next to 10 minutes away from a slightly larger town called Norfolk, spelled Norfolk. Yes, I think I said it right? I learned when I was there, Norfolk. And the newspaper editor there spoke about being very proactive about publishing features. When they would hear that a new community was coming, the plant had recruited from a new country, a new culture was on its way, they would publish feature stories that would sort of provide information about those communities. Building information, just offering information and trying to break down some of those barriers. So print, I can't speak for broadcast, but I think print has definitely gotten on board and tried to become an ally in the integration work in these places.
I'm from Bertrand.
Hi. I am a 32-year veteran of a New York State public high school in upstate New York, English department, department chair for 20 years. And
You're hired.
thank you. We are noted for our apple farms, our horse farms, and in 1986, we didn't have any Hispanic students when I started. Now we have a very healthy size Hispanic population. Now, this is my question. New York State has put its money where its mouth is and has mandated that public high school teachers, English included, because they have to pass the Regents exam in order to get a high school diploma, will have push in ELL teachers, English language learner teachers, for any class that has greater than 3 Hispanic students immigration. My question is Nebraska helping you, principal? Is Nebraska helping you? Or do you have any kind of program like that? Or is this falling solely on the shoulders of property taxes? So essentially, are your property taxes, your taxpayers, are they suffering? Do you have an ELL program? Are property taxpayers suffering because you're not getting subsidies from the state or federal government?
Excellent question. We are one of very few in Nebraska schools that, so we're a loud voice, but we're one of a few. So, for lack of a better explanation, sometimes when you're kid poor, you're school rich because you do get federal funding that is available. And so how we allocate that funding, the piece of the pie and how it works, our school is extremely supportive. We have an ELL academy that is amazing. We have, like I said, 1 out of every 4 of our students are identified as ELL, and we test them out pretty quickly. The state average is about 5 to 7 years. The process of reading to learn, or learning to read, excuse me, and then they'll talk about a switch. Our kids will talk about it. All of a sudden, we're reading to learn. We do it about 2 to 3 years because we're kind of a year-round deal. But we have 4 full-time ELL teachers, and in those classrooms, each is a separate classroom, about 30 kids. Each of those classrooms has 4 to 5 bilingual paraprofessionals. Some of them are teachers, certificated teachers that have come back and work in that role. And so I would love to have you visit. It's an amazing place. It has evolved. And so those are our level 1s and 2s if you're familiar with ELPA testing. Okay. The level 3s, we push out into a co-taught situation where we have a reg ed teacher and an ELL instructor, or a special education teacher, and so they have that support coming out. And so we see a lot of our kids in 2 to 3 years, because we can't wait 5 to 7 years. If we want kids to graduate, we want to be truly accountable, doing things with integrity academically. So that's what we have done, and so we have been able to allocate funds for that process, and it's worked very, very well. In fact, people are coming to us now to look at what we've done. It didn't always work so well. Okay, there's some things that we did. I can tell you what not to do, but it's worked very, very well so far, and we just feel like we're getting better and better. We created our own curriculum within that process too. Before it was just language acquisition. Now it's content in all of the core areas. So it's working well. But back to your question, there's not state funding or a push-in ELL teacher program or a mandatory requirement for that. But I like it. I'll talk to Governor Ricketts. How's that?
Are you getting any teen tension with the teens at the high school level between the Somali students and the Hispanic students in the lunchroom?
You know, if I say no, I would be lying, but it's the tension isn't really a cultural disparity or I think tension because of what I think you're maybe, and I don't mean to assume, regular teen tension that you see at my previous school that has nothing to do with culture. It's just teen tension. I think that our kids, one thing, and I may not answer your question, but it's amazing. Our kids grow up in this community and in this school, and they leave. And in Nebraska, they go to a university, and they come back, and they go, Mr. Hayner, where is all the color? Where's all the diversity? And so I think the tension, speaking to what I think you're asking, is less than what it would be perceived to be probably in another community where there are fewer or it's just happening. And again, Dora's been there for 30 years. I just jumped on the train 12 years ago, so I have a little different perspective. But thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. We'll head in the back.
Hi, my name is Susanna Deepa. I'm with ASCGSE in Washington. And I also have a question about schools. And in particular, you mentioned, Principal Kyle, that your student population is 80% or more immigrant. And I wonder, does this...
Minority. Immigrant refugee is about 25%. Yes, sorry.
And does this mean that the non-immigrant population, the white population, Anglo, different terms apply, do they opt out of your school? And if so, does that cause issues for integration for the younger folks and also for the community at large?
Great question. I don't think we see that. We have a lot that have moved in. The high school used to be about 375 kids 25 years ago. We're over 900 now, so we have more people coming in. In fact, I think when Sara wrote her paper, we were at 880. I think we're at 903 this morning, checking the demographics. So are there some that have left? Yes. More in 1996, there was a grand exodus of teachers, community members, those people that left, and so that did take place, but not now. I have a film that I put out. If you're in San Diego in February, I'm speaking out there about this, and we have the high ability learner, kid that was born here, etc., and a day in the life, and then we have a day in the life of one of our Hispanic kids, and then we pull it together and how we pulled that across. I just talked to a girl that is at Stanford, Julia Briones, who is a Hispanic young lady that is coming back, and she goes, you know, I always thought Lexington had some issues, and they still have a couple, but I really miss it there, and so I don't know what that means, but I think that we have a lot of people, Dora was talking about it earlier in the green room, that we have so many people that graduate from Lexington High School and come back to teach or come back to work in the community. That speaks volumes to me, and it will be your Latino kids, your African kids, we'll see, because we're still on the cusp there, but a lot of our white students will come back and say, I just want to be back here. And so there are a lot more positive stories than I think there would be negative. I can't think of any negative right now. Good question, though.
I'd just like to add that we have elementary school that is a dual language and is very popular with the Anglo community. they want their kids to be able to be bilingual.
I wanted to just provide some perspective from the Madison schools, which I also spent some time at, and they have experienced more of that dynamic that you're asking about. Similar sort of shock, I think, overall when the meatpacking plant moved into the community, but they've experienced some white flight, and they do have religious schools in neighboring communities that a lot of the white or Anglo families have opted to send their children to. Which has, challenged dynamics in the schools. And that football dynamic that I described earlier was a big one. So I think slowly the local schools are rebuilding their test scores, and attendance rates are very similar to Lexington's. They've done incredible work with very few resources. I think to your point around tax base, they've had some real challenges in levying those bonds in the past, which the principal and superintendent could speak to you about. But slowly, I think they're leading by example. They're showing test scores, they're showing results, and some of the families that had previously left are coming back and sending their kids there. And they do have the similar dynamic of graduates coming back to teach, which is really encouraging.
Well, thank you. I think. Thanks. I think we're going to wrap up here. But thank you all for coming, and thank you to our events team for helping us get this off the ground. Please check out our report, Patient and Proactive. It's on our website, www.americanprogress.org. And finally, please join me in thanking our panelists today.